Welcome. The topic today is not cooking liquids on Shabbos. We know that one of the 39 prohibited activities on Shabbos is not to cook. When we discussed not cooking solid foods, we learned that once something is fully cooked, it can never be cooked again. If you have a solid food that was already fully cooked, nothing will affect it further to be cooked anymore. But with liquids, it's not the same. We know that you can heat up water to the point of boiling, but afterwards, once it cools down, there's no difference between that water and water that was never cooked at all. So liquids go back to their original state. And the question becomes, in terms of avoiding cooking on Shabbos, how do we do this in regard to liquids? So that's what we wanted to do today. In general, the prohibited activity of cooking is probably the most practical prohibited activity in our lives. Each and every Shabbos, we try to have hot food. The prophets say, "V'karoso l'Shabbos oinig." Shabbos has to be a day of pleasure. When Shabbos comes in, it's not only about the spiritual experience, prayers, davening. What it's about is also that the body has to be happy. V'karoso l'Shabbos oinig. We have to have some sort of pleasure on Shabbos. And so, how are you going to have pleasure at your meal if you don't have hot food? And so Chazal specifically instituted that a person should try to have hot foods on Shabbos. We learned last time what the parameters are of cooking solid foods on Shabbos and how to avoid cooking them. But now, what we have to understand is what happens in regard to liquids. Many foods, in addition to the fact that they're solid, also have a liquid component. For example, if meat has some gravy with it, it's liquid. It follows the same laws then as warming of a liquid. And that's what we wanted to learn today. What are the exact parameters for liquids? And if I would say that if it's possible to get this clear, a person would really be able to avoid a lot of the confusing aspects that take place in terms of cooking on Shabbos. The first question is, at what point does liquid become cooked? What is the minimal point that we would consider a liquid as being cooked? The great halachic authority of the previous generation, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein of blessed memory, tells us that at 113 degrees Fahrenheit, water or any liquid might already be considered cooked. And so therefore we now have to be careful. We have to be careful from any liquid that's not cooked or in a state of being cold, not to heighten its temperature through a heating element until it reaches 113 degrees Fahrenheit. Now that's not so much. We know that body heat is 98.6, so therefore, when you touch something and you feel it's a little bit hotter, that might well be 113 degrees Fahrenheit. And so therefore, that would be the point that we'd be careful about. Come Chazal and they teach us that the specific point of becoming cooked by any liquid is a point that's defined as Yad Seledes Boy. A hand would react by pulling away from it because of its heat. Yad Seledes Bo means whenever a liquid reaches the level of heat where it's so hot that if a person would inadvertently touch it, he'd pull back in order not to be burned, that would be considered cooked, the level of cooking of liquid. The degree for this, according to Rav Moshe Feinstein, is 165 degrees Fahrenheit. If a liquid already reached 165 degrees Fahrenheit, it's considered cooked and cannot become cooked anymore, according to Rav Moshe Feinstein. To give you an idea of how hot this is, the average hot water urn, holds water at 175 degrees Fahrenheit. And so you get an idea that 165 degrees is a little bit, about 10 degrees below that. By the way, the actual boiling temperature for water, as we know, is 212 degrees. But that's when you want to boil the water initially. You have to build up the heat of the water until it gets to a boiling state. That's 212. It doesn't have to remain at that state in order for it to be considered cooked. It's still considered cooked, according to Rav Moshe Feinstein, at the level of 165 degrees. And so therefore, what that means practically for us is that if we have a hot water urn, and we warmed up water before Shabbos, and now the urn is holding the water at 175 degrees Fahrenheit, that means that water cannot become cooked anymore. So, for example, let's say a person has a hot pot of food on the fire. Customarily by Jewish people, we usually leave overnight a food that's called cholent. If a person has a hot cholent, hot meat, hot potatoes, and he wants to add some water, he can only add such water that's not going to become cooked because of the heat of the pot. The heat of the pot is totally cooked. It's coming straight off the fire. If I take some water from the faucet to add to it, that water is going to become cooked. I can't do it. But if I take water from the hot water urn that's over 165 degrees, that water is already cooked. It's not going to become cooked, and therefore that water I can add into the cholent pot. As long as it's 165 degrees, it doesn't become cooked anymore. So this is the definition for cooking of a liquid. From 113 degrees Fahrenheit until 165 degrees is the time that would be considered cooking. Obviously, we cannot take a liquid and put it on the fire on Shabbos if it's within that range. What happens if a liquid was already cooked? Here's the second thing for today. What happens if a liquid was already cooked, was already fully cooked, and now it went down in temperature? Would cooking apply? And the rule is that it would seem that once it goes below Yad Soledesbo, once it goes below 165, again, cooking would apply to raise its temperature. And that's the way many poskim hold. The psak that's accepted in general by all Ashkenazim is that if fully cooked liquid went down to the level where it's still warm, where you touch it and it's still warm enough that would be comfortable to eat, it would be pleasant to eat because of its warmness, it would not be considered cooking anymore. Wouldn't be considered cooking even if you add it to a hot food. That's if it's still warm. Once it gets so cold that a person wouldn't eat it because it's cold already, then a new level of cooking would apply. So what we've learned now is that once you have liquid that's fully cooked, it remains fully cooked, according to some, until it reaches 165 degrees. And according to others, even once it drops below 165, as long as it's still edible in its warm form, cooking would not apply. But here's the third rule for today, and here's where things get very interesting. The rabbis have taught us, and this is a reality of physics, that when you take water that was heated in a heating element, it was heated in a pot or an urn that's directly on a heating element. That water holds its temperature. Once you take that water and you spill it over to a second pot or any second utensil, a cup, the walls of the pot, the walls of the cup have a cooling effect. It cools down that water so much that the water doesn't have the same cooking abilities that it would have had at the level that it was in the first utensil. And so, in regard to liquids, we now differentiate between a first utensil and a second utensil. The first utensil is always that utensil that was directly on the fire. The liquids that are in that first utensil are so hot that they themselves could cook. If I would pour directly from the hot water urn on a raw food, it would be considered cooking, even though I never put the food on the fire, because the water itself is so hot from the first utensil that it can cook. But once that water goes into a second utensil, it's not so hot. It wouldn't cook everything, although it can cook certain foods that are very easily cooked. Since we're not sure what those foods are, we would not add to a second utensil only such foods that really take a long time to cook. The rabbis tell us that the two things that we know for sure take a long time to cook up are water and oil. So water and oil can be added to a second utensil already. But here we go further, and what if you take that second utensil and now you pour it into a third one? The walls of the third utensil cause the water now to cool even more. Now it's got even less of a heat intensity, and so therefore it can cook even less. And so the rule that we have is that basically, or almost nothing can be cooked in the third utensil. And so, if we want to use water on Shabbos in a way that will not cause cooking, we have water from the hot water urn, that's in the first utensil. We pour it into a cup, now it's in the second utensil. We pour from that cup into a third cup, now it's in the third utensil, now it can't cook anymore. That's the way to use liquids on Shabbos in a way that will not come to any prohibited form of cooking the liquid on Shabbos. There are two exceptions to this rule. In the third utensil, we still cannot put the following foods that are so easy to cook, they can even cook in the third utensil. The two foods are an egg. Eggs cook very easily, as we know, and small fish. Small raw fish, Chazal have determined, such as mackerel, maybe sardines. If you drop a raw fish so small, even in a third utensil would cook. But other than that, generally we hold that a third utensil does not cook. And so therefore, if a person wants to make themselves a coffee, a tea, using raw coffee, raw tea on Shabbos, what they would need to do is move the water into a third cup, a third utensil, and then they can make the tea. Tea leaves can be put, we'll talk about a bag of tea, hopefully in another shiur, but the raw leaves of tea can be put in a third utensil, according to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And so therefore, the way to use the water on Shabbos is always to try and have a third utensil. But here's one more very important piece of information that can really make a big difference to us. We said that once a liquid is fully cooked, it doesn't lose its status of being fully cooked until it cools off. But there is one aspect that remains even after it fully cools off. Something that was once fully cooked, even after it was fully cooled off, cannot become recooked if it goes into a second utensil. The second utensil is already weak enough that it will not recook liquids that were once fully cooked. Why is this important to us? Because so many of the foods that we buy nowadays that are manufactured for commercial use were already cooked and heated to full cooking level in the manufacturing process. All the instant powders, instant coffee, instant chocolate, instant tea, were all cooked already. Milk is already pasteurized in the process and fully cooked before it gets to our house. Ketchup was already cooked, and so therefore, once we have a second utensil, we can add these items that we know were already fully cooked, even though they're totally cold. And so therefore, if a person wants to make an instant coffee, he doesn't have to wait to use a third utensil. He can even use the second utensil. Add the powdered instant coffee into the second utensil because it's powder from liquid that was already cooked. Add the milk into the second utensil because it was already cooked. Add the sugar if the sugar during its processing was already fully cooked. This is the way that we can avoid any aspect of cooking liquids on Shabbos. May God help, and we be able to be careful in keeping all the prohibited acts on Shabbos, in order that we be able to experience that wonderful ultimate gift that God gives us each and every week, the gift of being in Gan Eden, the gift of being alone with Him in our homes and our hearts.